royal history wasn't just crowns and conquests. It was rulers being humiliated in public, losing wars to animals, dying in absurd ways, and having their worst moments quietly erased by loyal historians. This video is about what didn't make the paintings, the textbooks, or the legends. 44 royal embarrassments so bad they were buried on purpose. 1. You would expect Napoleon Bonaparte to be defeated by a massive army, but his most embarrassing loss was actually against a fluffball apocalypse of 3,000 bunnies. In 1807, his staff set up a rabbit hunt to celebrate a treaty, but they messed up big time by buying tame farm rabbits instead of wild ones. When the cages opened, the bunnies did not run away. They saw Napoleon and assumed he was a giant walking carrot. The hungry horde swarmed the emperor, climbed his legs, and hijacked his carriage in a relentless search for snacks. It is hilarious to picture the most terrifying general in Europe screaming and retreating from a battalion of twitchy noses. 2. King Henry VI of Germany presided over the single most disgusting event in royal history, known as the Urfort latrine disaster. In 1184, he called a meeting of high-ranking nobles in a church to settle a dispute. The problem was that the wooden floor was old, and the combined weight of dozens of fat aristocrats in heavy chainmail was simply too much. The floor suddenly collapsed, and the entire assembly fell into the monastery's massive cesspit located directly below. While the king survived by clinging to a stone window ledge for dear life, dozens of princes and knights literally drowned in liquid human waste. It gives a whole new meaning to a political shitstorm. 3. Justin II of the Byzantine Empire wasn't just a bad boss, he was a literal ankle-biter. In the late 6th century, the emperor went completely insane and developed a habit of trying to physically bite his servants' heads off during meetings. To keep him from eating the staff, his bodyguards built him a custom mobile throne, basically a royal stroller for a grown man, and wheeled him around the palace at high speeds. They also discovered that loud organ music soothed him, so the court spent all day blasting church music and zooming the emperor around the hallways in his cart like a toddler on a sugar rush, just to keep him from chomping on the advisors. 4. King George II proves that no matter how powerful you are, you can still be taken out by a bathroom break gone wrong. In 1760, the king went into his private water closet after his morning hot chocolate and literally pushed himself into the afterlife. His valet heard a loud crash and found the monarch on the floor, having exerted himself so hard that he burst a blood vessel in his chest. It is arguably the least heroic way for a king to die, trading a glorious death on the battlefield for a final showdown with the royal plumbing. He truly gave a whole new meaning to the term royal flush. 5. William the Conqueror had a funeral that went from solemn to a slapstick disaster movie in about 5 seconds. The king had become incredibly large in his old age, and the stone coffin prepared for him was clearly measured for a much skinnier guy. Instead of getting a bigger box, the stubborn priest decided to play a high-stakes game of Tetris and tried to jam the king into the tiny space. They pushed and shoved until the pressure became too much, and let's just say the king's stomach decided to pop like an overfilled balloon. The smell cleared the church faster than a fire alarm, forcing the bishops to finish the ceremony while holding their noses and trying not to faint. 6. King George IV turned his coronation into the world's most expensive episode of a reality TV show because he refused to invite his own wife. He hated Queen Caroline so much that he hired professional boxers to stand at the doors of Westminster Abbey like nightclub bouncers with a strict "no queens allowed" policy. While George was inside trying to look majestic in velvet, the entire city watched Caroline running around the church, banging on the doors and screaming to be let in. It was a total public relations nightmare as the king sat there sweating, pretending he could not hear his wife getting rejected by security outside the most holy building in England. 7. Peter III of Russia was technically an emperor, but mentally he was a toddler who took playtime way too seriously. His wife Catherine once walked into their room to find a full military court-martial taking place for a rat. Peter had built a tiny gallows and was reading legal charges to the rodent because it had chewed the head off one of his favorite marzipan toy soldiers. He genuinely believed the rat had committed treason against his toy army, and deserved the ultimate punishment. It is no wonder Catherine looked at this guy playing judge and jury with a pest and decided she would be a much better fit for the throne. 8. King Charles VIII of France is proof that you should always watch where you are going, even if you are royalty. In 1498, the king was rushing to watch a tennis match at the Castle of Amboise, which was apparently the most exciting event of the century. In his excitement, he forgot that door frames in the Middle Ages were quite low, and he slammed his forehead directly into a stone lintel at full speed. He hit the wall so hard that he fell into a coma and died a few hours later. It is a truly slapstick ending to a reign, as the man who commanded thousands of soldiers was ultimately taken out by a stationary piece of architecture that refused to get out of his way. 9. The Roman Emperor Caligula was famous for being completely unhinged, but his war against the ocean takes the prize for the most useless military campaign ever. He marched his highly trained legions all the way to the coast of Gaul, lining them up in battle formation as if they were about to invade Britain. But instead of ordering a charge against barbarians, Caligula ordered his confused soldiers to stab the water and fight the waves. After an exhausting battle with the tide, he declared a total victory over the sea god Neptune. To celebrate this glorious win, he made his elite troops collect thousands of seashells into their helmets to bring back to Rome as spoils of war. Imagine being a battle-hardened soldier forced to pick up beach souvenirs because your boss is having a tantrum. 10. Emperor Menelik. The second of Ethiopia took his religious devotion to a level that was frankly hazardous to his health. He genuinely believed that the Bible had medicinal properties, not spiritually but physically. Whenever he felt sick, he would tear out a few pages of scripture and eat them like aspirin. In 1913, he suffered a massive stroke, and in a panic, he decided he needed a heavy dose of holiness. He proceeded to eat the entire Book of Kings, page by page. Unsurprisingly, the paper and ink did not cure the stroke, and the emperor died shortly after, likely due to severe indigestion caused by snacking on the Old Testament. 11. Charles VI of France had one of the most fragile egos in history, but he also believed he had a fragile body because he was convinced he was made of solid glass. This was not a metaphor. The man genuinely thought his butt would shatter like a window if he sat down too hard. To protect his glassy self, he had iron rods sewn into his clothes to act as armor, and wrapped himself in thick blankets like a precious vase being shipped across the country. The situation got even grosser because he refused to change his clothes or take a bath for months, fearing that the water or the movement would cause him to break into a million pieces. His poor courtiers had to endure the smell of an unwashed king who waddled around in reinforced pajamas, screaming at people to stay away from his breakable torso. 12. Queen Victoria is the symbol of a strict and proper era, but her palace security was an absolute joke thanks to a teenager nicknamed the Boy Jones. This random kid managed to break into Buckingham Palace 3 separate times without any tools or skills, mostly because the doors were often left unlocked. He did not want to assassinate anyone. He just wanted to live like a royal for a few hours. Jones was caught sitting on the throne, eating food from the royal pantry, and most disturbingly, he was found with a pair of Queen Victoria's underwear stuffed down his pants. One time, the guards found him hiding under a sofa in the royal nursery, just listening to the conversations. It is hilarious that the most powerful woman on earth had a stalker who treated her palace like a free hotel. 13. King George III is mostly remembered for losing the American colonies, but there was a morning in Windsor Great Park where he completely lost his grip on reality. While taking a carriage ride, the king suddenly demanded the driver stop because he spotted someone important standing in the grass. He hopped out and walked directly up to an oak tree, convinced that the plant was actually the King of Prussia. George proceeded to have a very serious, long diplomatic conversation with the tree, even shaking one of its lower branches as if it were a hand. His servants and guards had to stand there in awkward silence, watching their monarch discuss international politics with a pile of wood and leaves. They eventually had to gently guide him back to the carriage, presumably leaving the tree very confused about the alliance. 14. The King of Sweden, Adolf Frederick, holds the heavy title of the monarch who ate himself to death, which is honestly a way better way to go than being beheaded. In 1771, he sat down for a feast that would have killed a hippopotamus. He devoured plate after plate of lobster, caviar, kippers, sauerkraut, and drank gallons of champagne. But he refused to stop there and decided to finish it off with 14 servings of his favorite dessert, sweet buns served in a bowl of hot milk. His stomach finally decided to go on strike against the abuse, and he died of severe indigestion later that night. It is a legendary exit, proving that his biggest enemy was not a foreign army, but his inability to say no to just one more pastry. 15. King John of England is remembered as a villain in the Robin Hood stories, but his real life was essentially a series of unfortunate events caused by his own incompetence. In 1216, while trying to cross a tidal estuary known as the Wash, he managed to lose the entire crown jewels in the mud. He miscalculated the tide like a confused tourist, and his baggage train was swallowed by the rising water and quicksand. We are talking about chests full of gold, swords, and the royal regalia just vanishing into the muck because the king did not check the weather report. He died shortly after, likely from the stress of knowing he was the only monarch to literally drown the national treasury in a swamp. 16. The Spanish Habsburgs were obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure, but Charles II of Spain proved that a family tree should branch out a little bit. By the time he became king in 1665, generations of inbreeding had created a man who baffled every doctor in Europe. He had a jaw so large he could barely chew. He could not walk until he was 8, and the autopsy report claimed his head was full of water and his heart was the size of a peppercorn. The royal physicians were so confused by his existence that they simply declared he must be bewitched. It is a tragic but absurd example of how the royal obsession with blue blood ended up creating a king who was biologically falling apart. 17. Louis XVI's attempt to escape the French Revolution is the ultimate lesson in why you should never stop for snacks when you are on the run. In 1791, the royal family tried to flee Paris in disguise, but Louis treated the escape like a leisurely family vacation. He insisted on traveling in a huge, conspicuous carriage, stopped multiple times for picnic breaks, and drove incredibly slowly. The final nail in the coffin was when a postmaster recognized him simply by looking at a gold coin, because the king's face was literally printed on the money. He was arrested not because of a brilliant police operation, but because he could not sacrifice his comfort for speed, turning a high-stakes escape into a failed road trip. 18. Being a close friend of Henry VIII was dangerous, but the most coveted job in his court was surprisingly disgusting. The title was Groom of the Stool, and the job description was exactly what it sounds like: assisting the king with his bathroom needs and wiping the royal bottom. While this sounds like a punishment, it was actually the highest honor a noble could receive because you were alone with the king during his most vulnerable moments. These men had huge political influence just because they handed the king a towel. It is hilarious to think that the most powerful nobles in England were fighting over who got to be the king's personal bathroom attendant, just to get a few minutes of gossip. 19. In 1618, tensions in Bohemia led to an event with the fantastic name the Defenestration of Prague, which is a fancy way of saying some guys got thrown out of a window. Protestant rebels stormed the castle and tossed 3 Catholic Habsburg officials out of a window that was 70 feet off the ground. You would expect them to go splat, but they all survived with barely a scratch. The Catholic side claimed they were saved by angels who caught them in midair, while the Protestants pointed out the inconvenient truth that they had actually landed in a massive, soft pile of horse manure that had piled up in the moat. Surviving an assassination attempt is cool, but having to admit you were saved by a giant heap of dung is a story they probably wanted to hide. 20. King George IV visits Scotland in 1822 and manages to turn a diplomatic mission into a fashion disaster. He wanted to honor Scottish culture by wearing a traditional kilt, but he made 2 critical errors. The kilt was far too short for his massive belly, and he decided to wear pink, flesh-colored tights underneath. The result was catastrophic because, from a distance, it looked like the King of England was walking around completely naked from the waist down. To make matters worse, he stopped wearing his corset for the event, so his royal stomach literally hung over the top of the kilt. The locals cheered, but they were mostly trying to hide their laughter at the sight of a monarch who looked like an overgrown, blushing toddler lost in a costume shop. 21. We usually picture declarations of independence as heroic moments, but Brazil's independence started because of a royal stomachache. In 1822, Prince Pedro was riding his mule when he was suddenly struck by a violent case of diarrhea. He had to stop the royal procession every few miles to squat in the tall grass. It was during one of these desperate bathroom breaks, while clutching his stomach in agony, that he received the letters demanding his return to Portugal. Fed up with the politics in his own bowels, he ripped off his armband and shouted, "Independence or death," right there on the side of the road. Famous paintings show him looking majestic on a stallion, but in reality, the guy was just trying to finish his business in a field. 22. Henry VIII thought he was the ultimate ladies' man, but his first meeting with Anne of Cleves was a romantic failure of epic proportions. Henry decided to surprise his new bride by dressing up in a ridiculous costume, some sources say a Robin Hood outfit, and barging into her room unannounced to kiss her. He thought she would instantly recognize his royal aura through the disguise and fall in love. Instead, Anne was terrified by this fat, strange man in a mask grabbing her, and she looked at him with total disgust. Henry's massive ego was so bruised by her reaction that he stormed out, changed his clothes, and returned as the king. But he never forgave her for not finding his creepy prank attractive. 23. Louis XIX of France holds the world record for the shortest and most pointless reign in history, lasting a grand total of 20 minutes. In 1830, his father abdicated the throne, making Louis the king. However, the crowd outside was revolting, and Louis was terrified of losing his head like his relatives. He spent his entire 20-minute rule sitting on a couch, arguing with his wife and crying, while his father begged him to sign the abdication papers. He finally cracked under the pressure and signed the document, ending his reign before he could even order lunch. Imagine training your whole life for a job, only to quit before you even finish your first coffee break. Yakin 24. King James I of England was so paranoid about being assassinated that he turned himself into a walking pillow. He was terrified of stilettos and daggers, so he ordered his tailors to stuff his doublets with thick layers of cotton and wool, making them knife-proof. The downside was that he looked absolutely ridiculous, like a round, waddling ball of fabric. The padding was so heavy and bulky that, if he fell over, he literally could not get back up without help. Foreign ambassadors struggled to take him seriously because the King of England looked less like a powerful monarch and more like a nervous marshmallow that was afraid of sharp objects. 25. King Charles II of Navarre lived a wicked life, but his death was a Looney Tunes skit. In 1387, he fell ill, and his doctors prescribed a wrapping in linen soaked in brandy to cure him. The nurse sewed him tightly into the alcohol-soaked sheets, but realized she didn't have scissors to cut the thread. In a moment of pure genius, she decided to use a candle flame to burn the loose thread. You can guess what happened next. The brandy-soaked king lit up like a human torch. He survived the initial fire but died weeks later from the burns, proving that alcohol and open flames are a bad mix, especially when you are sewn into your bedsheets. 26. Emperor Nero thought he was the greatest gift to the performing arts, but his audiences were literally dying to leave. He loved to sing and play the lyre for hours, and he legally forbade anyone from leaving the theater while he was on stage. The performances were so long and terrible that women reportedly gave birth in the aisles just to have an excuse to get out. Some men actually faked their own deaths, lying stiff on the benches so the undertakers would carry them outside just to escape the emperor's voice. You know your concert is bad when the crowd prefers playing dead over listening to your encore. 27. Before he became emperor, Napoleon III tried to stage a coup that looked more like a bad circus act than a military operation. In 1840, he landed in Boulogne with a small group of mercenaries and a tame eagle that he had bought from a pet shop. The plan was to release the eagle, which would symbolically land on his head to show he was the true heir of Napoleon Bonaparte. To ensure the bird cooperated, he reportedly hid a piece of bacon under his hat. But instead of crowning him, the bird ignored him completely, and flew off to find better snacks, leaving Napoleon standing there with meat on his head while the local garrison arrested him for disturbing the peace. 28. Christian VII of Denmark was essentially a frat boy who accidentally became king. He found court etiquette incredibly boring, so he spiced things up by physically pranking his own ministers during serious government meetings. His favorite move was to wait for a visiting dignitary to bow low out of respect, and then he would run and leapfrog over their backs like a child on a playground. He also enjoyed slapping people in the face mid-conversation just to see their reaction. The court had to constantly apologize to foreign ambassadors who had just been used as gym equipment by the giggling monarch of Denmark. 29. James II of Scotland had a fiery passion for artillery, but he really should have respected the safety guidelines. In 1460, he was besieging Roxburgh Castle and wanted to show off his favorite cannon, which he had affectionately named the Lion. He insisted on standing right next to the massive gun to watch it fire, despite his commanders telling him to back up. When the fuse was lit, the cannon did not fire a cannonball. Instead, the metal casing exploded, and a shard of iron effectively ended the king's siege along with his life. He is the only monarch in history to be killed by his own toy, because he just wanted a closer look at the boom. 30. King Farouk of Egypt, who ruled until 1952, had a hobby that was slightly below his pay grade. Specifically, he was a massive kleptomaniac who loved pickpocketing world leaders. Despite having limitless wealth and palaces full of treasure, Farouk famously stole a pocket watch from Winston Churchill during a dinner in Cairo. When Churchill noticed his timepiece was missing, Farouk sheepishly pretended to find it, claiming he had just picked it up off the floor. The king was so dedicated to his craft that he reportedly took lessons from a convicted thief to perfect his technique, often stealing wallets from visiting dignitaries just for the thrill of it. Imagine trying to negotiate a treaty while the king is slowly sliding your Rolex off your wrist. 31. King Alexander of Greece has the distinction of losing his throne and his life to a pet shop dispute. In 1920, he was walking his German shepherd in the palace gardens when a domestic Barbary macaque monkey attacked his dog. Alexander jumped in to break up the fight, but a second monkey rushed in and bit the king on the leg and torso. He ignored the wounds, thinking it was just a scratch, but the bites became severely infected with sepsis. The king died a few weeks later, causing a massive political crisis and a war that changed the map of Europe. It is wild to think that entire nations collapsed just because a monarch got into a fistfight with an angry monkey and lost. 32. Frederick William I of Prussia had a collection that was weirder than stamps or coins. He collected tall dudes. He was obsessed with creating a regiment called the Potsdam Giants, where every soldier had to be over 6 feet tall. He spent a fortune buying tall men from other countries, and if they refused to join, he would literally have them kidnapped and dragged to the barracks. He even tried to force tall soldiers to marry tall women, hoping to breed a race of supersized babies like he was running a human farm. Foreign diplomats laughed at the fact that the King of Prussia spent his days measuring the inseams of potential recruits instead of actually governing his country. 33. The history of the Norman conquest was almost derailed by a toilet prank gone wrong. William the Conqueror's sons were bored in a castle one day in 1077, so William Rufus and Henry decided to dump a full chamber pot, yes, a bucket of pee, over the head of their older brother, Robert Curthose, from a balcony. Robert was humiliated, soaked in waste, and absolutely furious that his dad did not punish the pranksters. This literal splash of disrespect started a massive family civil war that lasted for years. It is hilarious to realize that armies were mobilized and castles were besieged, all because two royal brothers thought it would be funny to give their sibling a golden shower. 34. Empress Elizabeth of Russia loved fashion, but she had a twisted sense of humor that humiliated every man in her court. She organized mandatory metamorphosis balls where all the men were forced to dress as women and the women as men. The problem was that Elizabeth was petite and looked great in men's clothes, but her generals were old, fat, and hairy. She forced these tough, battle-hardened military commanders to squeeze into tight corsets, wear massive hoop skirts, and stumble around in high heels while she laughed at them. The men despised these parties because they had to shave their legs and pretend to be dainty ladies just to keep their jobs, creating the most awkward dance floor in Russian history. 35. The Roman Emperor Elagabalus was the ultimate chaotic teenager who treated the Roman Empire like his personal toy box. He loved to terrify his dinner guests by releasing lions, leopards, and bears into the dining room while everyone was drunk and passing out. The guests would wake up screaming, thinking they were about to be devoured, only to realize that Elagabalus had defanged and declawed the animals, turning them into giant, harmless house cats. He also enjoyed serving his guests food made entirely of wax, wood, or stone, sitting back and laughing hysterically as hungry senators broke their teeth trying to bite into a fake steak. It was a reign of terror, but instead of executions, the weapon of choice was an annoying practical joke that never ended. 36. Paul I of Russia was so obsessed with preventing a revolution that he turned into the world's most violent fashion police. He hated the French Revolution so much that he banned anything that looked remotely French, including round hats, waistcoats, and shoelaces. He posted soldiers on the streets of St. Petersburg with orders to physically rip illegal hats off people's heads and burn them on the spot. If you wore a tailcoat, the police would cut the tails off right there in the street, leaving you looking like a jagged mess. The emperor spent more time policing the wardrobe choices of confused pedestrians than running the country, convinced that a round hat was the gateway drug to anarchy. 37. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, known as the Mad King, took social anxiety to a level that honestly deserves respect. He hated dealing with real people so much that he invented imaginary friends to have dinner with. He would force his servants to set a full, elaborate table for King Louis XIV of France and other dead monarchs, serving multi-course meals to empty chairs. The servants had to bow, scrape, and make polite conversation with the invisible ghosts while Ludwig nodded along seriously. He also slept all day and rode his sleigh at night to avoid seeing anyone, living like a vampire who just wanted to eat his schnitzel without making small talk. 38. Queen Anne of Great Britain is famous for uniting England and Scotland, but by the end of her reign, she was mostly famous for being shaped like a cube. She suffered from such severe gout and obesity that she lost the ability to walk entirely. During her coronation, she had to be carried in a sedan chair by a team of strong yeomen because she physically could not stand at the altar. When she died, her coffin was so wide and square-shaped that it looked more like a packing crate for a refrigerator than a royal casket. The struggle to hoist her massive, box-like coffin into the crypt was a logistical nightmare that had the undertakers sweating more than the mourners were crying. 39. Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of China and a military genius, but he was defeated by his own gullibility and a bottle of poison. He was terrified of dying and ordered his alchemist to find the elixir of life so he could rule forever. His doctors, who were clearly not board certified, gave him special immortality pills made of mercury. The emperor happily downed the liquid metal, believing it was magic juice. But instead of living forever, he slowly went insane and died of heavy metal poisoning. It is the ultimate irony that the man who built the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army killed himself because he thought drinking toxic thermometer fluid was a health hack. 40. Pope Stephen VI hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, so much that he refused to let death stop their argument. In 897, Stephen ordered the corpse of Formosus to be dug up, dressed in full papal robes, and propped up on a throne for a trial known as the Cadaver Synod. A deacon stood next to the rotting skeleton to answer for him, while Stephen screamed at the bones, accusing the dead man of perjury. The skeleton was found guilty, stripped of its robes, and thrown into the river. It was a moment where the entire Catholic Church essentially paused to watch a man have a legal battle with a pile of bones, proving that some grudges really do last forever. 41. Empress Dowager Cixi of China was a woman who valued tradition over everything, even if it meant defying the laws of physics. When she was presented with one of the first automobiles in China, a fancy Durya motor wagon, she was excited until she realized the driver had to sit in front of her to operate the wheel. In her mind, no servant could ever sit with their back to the queen or be positioned higher than her. She ordered the driver to kneel while driving or sit behind the car, which obviously made steering the vehicle completely impossible. The car ended up gathering dust in a palace warehouse because the Empress could not understand that an engine does not care about royal protocol. 42. Queen Joanna of Castile earned the nickname Joanna the Mad, not because of her policies, but because she could not let go of her husband, literally. When Philip the Handsome died in 1506, Joanna refused to accept the breakup. She had his coffin opened multiple times to check that he was still there and proceeded to take his corpse on a tour across Spain. She traveled at night by torchlight, dragging the hearse through the countryside, and forbade any women from coming near the coffin because she was still jealous that her dead, decomposing husband might cheat on her. Her father eventually locked her away, presumably because a road trip with a rotting corpse is not a great look for the monarchy. 43. Queen Maria Eleonora of Sweden took the phrase "till death do us part" way too literally. When her husband, King Gustavus Adolphus, died in 1632, she refused to let him go. She had his heart removed and placed in a golden box that she hung over her bed. She also forced her young daughter to sleep in a room draped in black mourning cloth, with the king's heart watching over them. She spent her days weeping and hugging the box, terrifying the entire court who just wanted to bury the king and move on. It was a level of attachment that went from romantic to a psychological horror movie very quickly. 44. Frederick Barbarossa was the Holy Roman Emperor and a legendary warrior, but his death was basically a PSA for water safety. During the Third Crusade, he arrived at the Salef River in Turkey. Instead of waiting for his army to cross the bridge like a normal person, he decided to show off his manly impatience and rode his horse directly into the water. He forgot one tiny detail. He was an old man wearing about 100 pounds of solid steel armor. He immediately sank like a stone and drowned in waist-deep water while his horrified army watched. The crusade fell apart instantly because it is really hard to follow a leader who gets defeated by a gentle stream. After all that power, bloodlines, and divine right, here's the uncomfortable part. This list is not complete. It never is. So tell me, which royal humiliation did history try to hide that we didn't expose here? And why is it worse than everything you just heard? Name it. Defend it. Start chaos. Like, subscribe, and don't pretend you didn't enjoy watching crowns fall apart.